Welcome to episode 1 of The Samurai in Our Closet. My name is Mandy. By retracing the life of my father, I will try to uncover the untold stories of Canadians of Japanese heritage, stories hidden for years like the samurai sword in our family closet. In episode 1, I join a historic walking tour through the area where my father once had a happy childhood, the now neglected downtown Eastside of Vancouver, which before Pearl Harbour was a thriving neighborhood known as Japantown. My grandparents arrived in BC in the early 1900s. To truly understand the challenges my grandparents faced as newcomers in Canada and the broader conditions that ultimately led to the internment, according to Tosh Kitagawa, a longtime activist and co-author of the book Silence, we'd have to understand what happened when BC joined Confederation. Here's a recording of Tosh's presentation to the Vancouver Historical Society.
The racialization and discrimination against Asians did not begin with Canada's entry into World War II. It began in 1871 when BC joined Confederation. At that time, the population in British Columbia was roughly 50,000 people. Of that number, 10,000 were European whites, 40,000 were Aboriginal and Asians. Recognizing that they were vastly outnumbered, one of the first acts of the legislature was to disenfranchise Indians and Chinese. In 1895, BC passed an amendment to the Provincial Elections Act which stated, "No Chinaman, Japanese, or Indian shall have his name placed on the register of voters for any electoral district or be entitled to vote in any election." This act denied all people who were non-white to practice in any profession such as law, medicine, accounting, engineering, nursing, etc. The non-whites were doomed to work only in the 4 primary industries: farming, fishing, mining, and logging.
Through hard work and innovation, Japanese Canadians thrived in these industries, but continue to face backlash. Fear over jobs fueled the riot of 1907, in which large angry mobs vandalized and attacked people in Chinatown and Japantown. It is considered to be the longest race riot in Canadian history. 7 years later, in 1914, is the beginning of World War I. While Canadians of Japanese heritage still did not have the right to vote, men still signed up to fight for Canada. Here is Susan Yatabe, a researcher on Japanese Canadian history.
Over 200 Japanese Canadian soldiers fought in the First World War. Most were living in British Columbia, but they were rejected for service. Determined to prove their loyalty to Canada, they traveled to Alberta to enlist and participated in the major battles, including Vimy Ridge and Passchendaele. Of the original group, 54 were killed, 92 were wounded. 13 received military medals for bravery.
In 1925, my father, George Shintani, was born in the downtown Eastside in Vancouver, BC. And I've driven to the place where my father's story begins. And I wonder, what would my father think of this place now? Let's go out and take a look. If we imagine Japantown before the war, you would have seen a community that was vibrant, with 8,000 Japanese Canadian residents and over 400 thriving businesses. I can see from the bones of the historic buildings, with their striking architecture, innovative design, and vibrant colors, that this was a place that the community took great pride and care in. Sadly, now when I look around, it looks more like an industrial ghost town. The buildings are dilapidated. or vacated, and many people here are unhoused. One of the reasons for the decline in this area is that the city started to change the zoning to industrial use, and wealthier Japanese Canadians started moving into districts like Marpole, Kitsilano, and Kerrisdale. However, everyone still knew each other, and all sections kept in touch through religious and sporting activities. I'm standing where my father lived on Cordova Street, but now it's just a field in an industrial area. Like many Japanese Canadian families and new immigrants, they had a large family with 6 kids. My father had 4 older sisters, which he referred to as Bossy, and a younger brother. Here's actor Ewan Craig reading from my father's journal about his home and their close community. And I try to imagine those days, humble but a welcoming home.
Our house was small, too small, but with a big front yard and a backyard. Out back, there was a wooden bath. Once in a while, we'd invite the neighbors over to bathe. There would be 4 people at a time on the bench, washing and rinsing. Instead of a fridge, we had an ice box with a big block of ice. And every morning, the milkman delivered 1 bottle of milk for all of us. It was a long time before my parents bought a radio. And what a luxury to listen to the hit parades! Each day, my mother made miso soup with rice for breakfast, and then off to school. My mother was sweet, always smiling, a hard worker, and a good mother with lots of friends. Her whole life, she always spoke Japanese, and she never spoke English.
I've come to an area near the ocean front where there used to be a large fishing cannery where my grandmother, or Bachan, along with many Japanese Canadian women worked. Here's my father describing her job from a recorded interview from the Nikkei National Museum in 2009 when my father was 84.
When we were in Vancouver, she worked up in the fish cannery, but that was hard work. And it's kind of, cold and damp, and they work piecework too. And I think they were just making a few cents a can. The one good thing about the cannery was they had a Japanese foreman there. They can take home any fish that they wanted too. So we always had fresh fish, whether it be salmon or herring, salmon eggs. So, it's good.
My father and his siblings always spoke with great love about Bachan, but we recently uncovered a long-kept secret that goes all the way back to 1917. My cousin Eric Shintani found a marriage record showing that Bachan was first married to a man named Yonezo Nakamura. They came from Kyushu and had 2 sons, but sadly Yonezo died just 3 years later. I'm discussing those 2 sons with my cousin, Lori Harada. So I guess the story of them being sent back in the ship to Japan must be true.
So she would have taken them back then. So when I was living in Japan in the 80s, I actually visited one of the sons, and I was told by our cousin not to ask the uncle about Bachan, because his last memory of her was him running after her, and she was in a rickshaw being taken to the ship to go back to Canada. And so he was running after her saying, "Don't leave, don't leave." And that was his memory.
Well, Dad said in his journal that his father, Tazo Shintani, he didn't want the 2 sons to stay with them.
And I think what I remember from talking with my mom is she was sending money, and I think her hope was to bring them to Canada, but they never came. And you think, how did she do that? This woman had been through the loss of a husband, leaving her 2 first babies with relatives and not seeing them, and then having 6 more kids and working at a canning factory. How did she stay so positive?
It seems that the first generation, or Issei in Japanese, often stayed outwardly positive, hiding their hardships so their children could enjoy their childhood. My father recalled fishing for crabs using old bike wheels tied to ropes, and biking across the iconic Lions Gate Bridge to camp along the untouched Capilano River. Here's Dr. Aki Hori, who also lived in Japantown, recalling the carefree days of roaming around Vancouver. This recorded interview is from the Return from Exile project with the Nikkei National Museum.
The adults at home in Healy Avenue were my mother and my grandfather, Hori. And they had no idea what the kids were doing. You know, on weekends, for instance, we did a lot of roller skating. So we roller skated to Stanley Park, and that's quite a distance from Healy Avenue, and to look for tadpole and frog eggs. And we take a glass jar, and Stanley Park was a forest, and we'd go looking for ditches with water running, and we find frog eggs, and we'd bring them home and watch them hatch into tadpoles and eventually in adult eggs or frogs. So that was one adventure. We would walk across the Burrard Bridge through downtown Vancouver, Burrard Bridge, to Kitsilano to go swimming.
Strathcona was the elementary school for kids growing up in Japantown, including my dad. I've driven to the school on Pender Street. It was nicknamed the League of Nations School in the 1930s. And my father described playground fights with the Chinese and asking his mom to make spaghetti after having it for the first time with Dookie Adams' family, who were Italians. His mother tried her best to make Canadian food, and spaghetti was one of my dad's favorite foods all his life. My cousin Lori Harada describes how her mother connected with non-Japanese friends with food.
They were integrated when they went to public school. I know she had stories of swapping sandwiches, and the Caucasian kids would always fight to get, like, my mom's sandwiches, which was white bread, butter, and leftover chow mein with salt and pepper on it. And she would swap them for like a bologna sandwich, which is stuff she wouldn't get.
I'm heading down now to join a historic Powell Street walking tour organized by the Japanese Language School on Alexander Street with guide Margaret Coots. This is the same school that my father attended as a youth until the internment. Can you tell me a little bit about yourself and how you got interested?
Yeah, so I actually went to the Japanese language school. After a year of doing calligraphy, I started learning the language. I wanted to keep telling the story of what happened so that it never happens again. My parents are from Russia, so I'm not Japanese. I want to make it clear that I'm not trying to say it's my history. I just think that somebody needs to say it. Students would take their normal courses at Strathcona Elementary School and then come to the Vancouver Japanese School.
My relatives had told me that this Japanese language school was the center of the community, where they had a lot of classes, but also a lot of community events.
If you look at the entrance, it says Japanese Hall or Japanese Language School, and it says it in English. Japanese community purposely did this so that it would be open to everybody. During the internment, all of the Japanese Canadian property was confiscated, except for the Vancouver Japanese Language School, because it was a non-for-profit organization. Under the War Measures Act, the Canadian government could not take it away from the Japanese Canadian community.
That's amazing that that was the only reason why they were able to save it.
In 1949, the society was declared in default for not doing their filings, even though the members had been interned, but the board of directors were able to use postmail, even though they're scattered in different camps. And they were able to put the society back in good standing.
And now this building again is really a center point for the Japanese Canadian community.
It is home to over 400 students from preschool age to adults.
While Japanese Canadians embrace life in Canada, regular attendance at the Japanese language school represented how important the Issei wanted the second generation, or Nisei in Japanese, to maintain the language. My father recalls when he and a friend received the comment of Murishin on the report card, loosely translated to "a more genuine effort is required."
I think a lot of us resent having to go to Japanese school, after your normal school. I remember once, must have been grade 8 or so, we got a report card. And if you pass, it said Shinkyu. But if you just pass, it said Muri Shinkyu. So I remember after we got our report card, he was trying to take the Muri out. And he took the Muri out, but I left a big hole in it. But I took mine and I sent it to my mother, and all she told me was I should try harder.
So as we continue to walk toward Gore Street, on our left side, we have the Girls' School of Practical Arts. It was established in the 1930s to assist women in finding jobs, and sewing and dressmaking in the Japanese Canadian community was a legacy of pride, skill, and accomplishment. If you were a girl, you only had two choices. You could either get married or find some way to support yourself. Japanese Canadian women were able to do this was through establishing their own shops or making clothing for clients from their homes or attending dressmaking academies.
Their skills as dressmakers would explain why everyone looks so beautifully dressed in the old photos. My Aunt Husky used her talent as a dressmaker to establish a shop with 4 employees in the posh Carousel area. Here's my sister Claire Shintani recalling the story of my grandfather, or Ji-chan, bragging about my aunt's success.
She was gifted as a seamstress, and she had her shop quite young. Was it 21? The men would sit around and brag about their sons. Oh, my son earned this, and my son is doing this. And then he would quietly, because I guess Auntie Husky would give him all her earnings, he would show them, oh, well, this, my daughter made this, right? So he was very proud of her.
So if we come back up to Alexander Street and go to 362 on Alexander Street, we come to one of the most controversial places on Powell Street. So this was a restaurant operated by Itsuri Mori. There were a lot of criminal activities and gambling involved with him, and this was where at least some of it happened.
Well, that is where perhaps my grandfather worked. Apparently, he had a photographic memory, and that made him a really good dealer.
While the family talked a lot about Bachan, my grandfather, or Ji-chan, was a mystery. Here's my father discussing him.
His name was Tazo Shintani. And I think he tried different things. He had store, I think he had a dry cleaner one time. But he ended up working for this Japanese club there. I think they opened up the club because what was happening was a lot of Japanese used to go to Chinatown to gamble. Of course, they didn't like the idea of having the Japanese money going over to Chinatown. So they opened up this Japanese club, and of course there's gambling going on there.
With Mr. Mori?
Yeah, Mr. Mori.
You can imagine how shocked we were when we found this next video called Etsuji Mori, produced by the Nikkei National Museum. The narrator is Kai Nagata.
Of all the Japanese Canadians on Powell Street, Mori was easily the most controversial and mysterious. Here in Vancouver, he controlled a criminal empire, yet remained a close confidant of the RCMP. In fact, in 1921, he killed a man in broad daylight, yet beat the charge of murder. In the 1930s, above the Yoshino restaurant, Mori opened the Nippon Club and used that as a base to control all the gambling activity in the neighborhood. Newspapers began calling Mori the Al Capone of Powell Street.
And here's my sister Jay Shintani discussing our reflections about Ji-chan and Mr. Mori.
So how do you feel about having your Ji-chan work for a gangster?
Yeah, you know what? I've been thinking about that a lot. I think in those days you just did whatever you could to survive. They didn't have a lot of money, and he already lost the stores. What do you think about him working for a gangster?
I agree with you. Who are we to judge his decisions back there when he was trying to support his family? I'm okay with him working for a gangster.
I think we can say that
No.
grandfather did work for a gangster, so don't mess with us.
So now we're going to continue our way past the Timur building, and we reach Oppenheimer Park. The Powell Street grounds were home fields to the famous Japanese-Canadian baseball team, which were the Asahi baseball team.
Here is Ed, the son of Kei Kamanishi, the last surviving Asahi, describing how the team used a strategy called brain ball, 50 years before the term moneyball was used, resulting in the team winning every championship title in the Pacific Northwest several times over, which author Pat Adachi of the book Asahi Legends in Baseball compares to the story of David and Goliath.
The problem was when they were playing, their opponents were bigger and hit further, and they couldn't hit as far as their opponents. So they had to come up with a different strategy and bunt and steal the bases. And they call it squeeze play, and we call it sacrifice bunts and sacrifice flies and stuff to get the runners to advance on the bases. And that's how they were able to beat their stronger opponents.
The Asahis used skill, persistence, and passion to win, but also as a way to break down racial barriers. Remember, they were voted most popular team in Vancouver during a time when Japanese Canadians were restricted from entering mainstream restaurants and were segregated in movie theaters. They were the heroes of Japantown, and like all boys, my father dreamed of being an Asahi player. Here's my father describing how much the team also meant to Ji-chan.
He also liked me playing baseball too. He probably like to see me play for the Asahi ball team. One of the things he used to do was take me to these Asahi games and that.
He was a big supporter, was he?
He was. He wouldn't miss a game. He used to go down and sit in the seats there. You had to pay 10 cents. Most people stand out watching the game.
Did you ever aspire to be an Asahi player?
Well, I did, yes. We used to play a lot of balls, but of course I was only 16.
Oh, well, thank you so much. I so enjoyed the tour, and I learned a lot, and I really appreciate that you're trying to use it as well to educate school-based kids and other people who live in Vancouver.
Thank you for this opportunity, because I think it's really important that everybody should know about this story of this wonderful place.
While my father's family lived modestly in Japantown, as this was often the entry point for the first generation, when I visited Steveston in the Fraser Valley, I was astounded by how many Japanese Canadians lived in these areas before the internment and were a driving force in the economy at a time when they were largely restricted to work only in fishing, farming, mining, and lumber. In Steveston Village, now part of City Richmond, and once built on fishing, canning, and farming, 2,000 of the 2,500 residents were Japanese Canadians. On the Fraser Valley, they came to dominate the fishing industry, despite ongoing efforts to reduce the number of licenses they could hold. They were also skillful and innovative farmers. I went to the Maple Ridge Museum and asked curator Melissa Rowlett about a map showing where Japanese Canadians had farms in an area where my mother's family had 60 acres of greenhouses.
All this area here is super dense. So this was land that white settlers were not interested in because it was far too much work. But on the flip side, that also meant it was really cheap land. So that was kind of the land the Japanese Canadians bought. And so they had to hand clear all of that of dynamite or just axes, etc. They started doing greenhouses and were also able to grow more berries. It just was a better way of running a business with the greenhouses. And so in the 30s, 40s, Maple Ridge and the Fraser Valley became the berry capital of Canada because of that.
With continued success of Japanese Canadians, I think the next passage best illustrates the growing resentment and fear they faced. Concerns about their economic strength were openly voiced by groups like the Native Sons of BC, a heritage society who promoted the idea of preserving BC for people of European descent. Here's a reading from a 1932 pamphlet by actor Dougal Naismith.
The Native Sons of British Columbia are unequivocally opposed to extending the franchise to the Asiatic races. Many of us can remember the days when the Orientals, then comparatively few in number, were our servants. We saw them leave those humble domestic and manual pursuits in which they were engaged and become the competitors to our farmers. Then they gradually entered into trade and the business occupations of our urban life and invaded the professions. Once our servants, now our competitors in industrial occupations and commercial and economic spheres. Today they are demanding full citizenship. Give it to them, and tomorrow they will be our masters.
Much to my husband's surprise, he recently found a membership pin from the Native Sons of BC that belonged to his great-grandfather, Albert Edward Taylor, tucked away in a box of his father's things. Another secret out of the closet and a testament that people can change over time. In 1939, World War II starts in Europe. Despite rising hostilities towards Japanese Canadians, they wanted to prove their loyalty by enlisting in the Canadian military, but faced heavy discrimination, especially in BC. 32 Nisei, or second generation from outside BC, managed to enlist before Pearl Harbour, when Japanese Canadians were banned from enlisting, serving in Europe, some along with their brothers, others as the sons of World War I veterans. Japan signed treaties with Germany and Italy in 1937 and then commenced open war in China, considered to be the beginning of World War II in Asia. Once atrocities committed by the Japanese in China became public knowledge, people became even more suspicious of Japanese Canadians. In Vancouver, there were boycotts of Japanese products and loud anti-Japanese demonstrations. BC politicians shouted, "They are the enemy. They have to be watched. They are not to be trusted. They should be controlled." As anger towards Japanese Canadians grew, everyday life became more fearful. Here's history researcher Susan Yatabe again, sharing how her grandfather narrowly escaped an attack.
Anyone of Japanese background in Vancouver became more and more nervous when among white people. Japan was becoming aggressive in the Pacific, and people in Vancouver were linking all Japanese Canadians to Japan's actions and making false accusations. My grandfather would wear his Canadian Legion hat if he was among white people. Surely nobody would attack a Canadian Legion member. One night, he was chased by a stranger and was able to get into his house before he got beaten up. My mother remembers this very well, as her father suddenly burst into the house, out of breath and terrified.
Here again is author Tosh Kitagawa on how the government increased control of the Japanese Canadians and their assets in his presentation to the Vancouver Historical Society.
Between May and August of 1941, with the passing of council called the Oriental Registration, the RCMP began registering all people of Japanese descent over the age of 16 years. ID cards were issued, which had to be carried at all times. Failure to show it was stopped by the police outside of your property meant at least 6 months in jail. This was done 8 months before December the 7th, 1941. Thus, the government knew where every Japanese Canadian family lived.
And then came the event that changed everything.
December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
And here's actor Ewan Craig reading my father's journal about Pearl Harbor.
That morning, my brother, Sock, and I were playing outside when my older sister, Eileen, came out of the house. She looked upset. She said in a loud, serious voice, "Japan has bombed Pearl Harbor, and Canada and the US have declared war on Japan." At that time, I didn't know where Pearl Harbor was, or why it was important, but I knew what a declaration of war meant. Sock was 11 and Eileen was 20, and we were scared. There was a lot of hate against the Japs talk, and I was worried it would get worse. How right I was. The next morning, I had to take a streetcar to Vancouver Technical School for my grade 11 classes. What a long and dreadful journey. I remember standing, hanging onto the strap, looking straight ahead, feeling all eyes on me, trying to ignore the talk. But things were only going to get worse.
I wonder if my father had any idea what was in store for him in the coming months and years. Thank you for listening to the podcast, The Samurai in Our Closet. Join me in episode 2, where I will travel with other Canadians of Japanese heritage to visit remote ghost towns and other internment sites on a bus tour organized by the Nikkei National Museum. I will learn about the heartbreak of the internment and surprisingly beautiful stories of the resilience of Japanese Canadians to build a strong community within those camps, laser focused on the well-being of their children. Thank you to Shinobu Homa for his taiko drumming. The Samurai in Our Closet was produced by me, Mandy Shintani. The podcast editor was Claude Tanabe, with script editing by Lori Hirata and research by Susan Yatabe. We gratefully acknowledge the support of the Community Fund of the Japanese Canadian Legacies Society and the dedication of our podcast committee members, Tom Boivin, Kim Walker, Phil Burton, Graham Watts, and my sisters Jay and Claire Shintani. Special thanks as well to everyone I interviewed. Your stories made this podcast possible.